The quiet regret most people only admit after 70. There is a name in your phone that you have not called in 14 years. You know exactly whose name it is. You do not need to scroll to find it. Some nights, you sit at the kitchen table, the house quiet around you, and you look at that name for a long time. Your thumb hovers over the call button, and then, almost every time, you put the phone down. Not because you are busy, not because you forgot, but because somewhere along the way, the distance between you and that person became easier to carry than the conversation it would take to close it. This is not a story about anger. It is not even really a story about that one person anymore. It is a story about something quieter, something that most people do not say out loud until they are 70 or 80, or sitting in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning. It is the regret that has no drama in it. No big mistake to point to. Just years quietly passing, while you told yourself there would be more time. Today, we are going to talk about the regrets that people rarely say out loud. Not because they are ashamed, but because these regrets do not sound dramatic enough to mention. They sound small. A phone call not made. A sentence not said. An ordinary Tuesday afternoon spent apart instead of together, because you assumed there would be another one. But if you have lived long enough, you already know these are not small at all. They are the ones that sit the heaviest, precisely because no one warned you they would matter this much. So we are going to walk through 9 of these quiet regrets together, one by one, honestly, gently. Not to make you feel worse about the past, but so that whatever time is left in your hands is spent a little more awake to what actually matters. Some of what we cover today may feel uncomfortably familiar. That is not an accident, and it is not a coincidence either. It is simply what happens when someone finally puts words to a feeling you have carried quietly, maybe for years, without ever hearing anyone else describe it out loud. Let yourself sit with whatever comes up. There is nothing here to fix in a hurry. There is only something worth noticing clearly for what may be the first time. Reason number 1 begins with something so ordinary you have probably done it, or rather not done it, just this week without even noticing. Think about the last time you told someone you loved them. Not in a birthday card. Not with a text and a heart at the end. Out loud, in your own voice, plainly. Can you remember when that was? For a lot of people your age, this question lands strangely. Of course they know I love them, you might think. I have shown it for 50 years. In the meals I cooked, the bills I paid, the nights I sat up worrying, the 100 small sacrifices nobody ever wrote down. And you would be right. Love was shown. It just was not always said. This is not an accident. Most people who are 70 or 80 now were raised by parents who came out of hard decades, the Depression, a world war, or the quiet discipline that followed both. In those households, love was not a sentence. It was a roof over your head and food on the table. Saying, "I love you" out loud could feel almost indulgent, even embarrassing, like admitting to something soft in a world that demanded you be tough. So an entire generation learned to translate feeling into action, and to leave the words unsaid, assuming the actions spoke loudly enough. Here is the problem with that assumption. Actions are read differently by the person doing them than by the person receiving them. You know, in your own heart, that working 60-hour weeks was an act of love for your family. But a child does not always experience an absent, exhausted parent as love. They experience the absence. They experience the exhaustion. The love underneath it is invisible to them unless someone names it out loud. Decades later, that child, now an adult with children of their own, may still be quietly waiting to hear the words that were always true, but never spoken. It is not only children who wait for these words. It shows up in old friendships too. The friend you have known since 1962, who you talk to every week about the weather and your grandchildren's soccer games, but never about what that friendship has actually meant to you. 60 years of loyalty, and neither of you has ever said the sentence, "You are one of the most important people in my life." You assume it is obvious. It is not. Obvious is a word we use to comfort ourselves out of doing the harder, more vulnerable thing. Even marriages carry this quietly. Couples married 40, 50 years can fall into a rhythm where love becomes so assumed, so structural, that naming it starts to feel almost unnecessary. Like announcing that the sun rose this morning. But your spouse is not the sun. Your spouse is a person still quietly wondering on some nights whether the feeling is still there, still chosen, still meant. For men of this generation especially, the silence often runs even deeper. Boys were taught, in ways so consistent they rarely needed to be said out loud, that emotion was something to manage privately, not to display. A man could show love by fixing the car, by walking a daughter down the aisle, by standing quietly at the back of every graduation, camera in hand. What he was rarely given permission to do was simply say the sentence. So he found other sentences instead. Drive safe. You did good. Call me when you land. Each one a kind of code for the 3 words underneath it that never quite made it out. And so you find yourself here, later in life, sitting across from a son or a daughter or a grandchild you love enormously, and something in you locks up right at the moment the words could come out. It is not that the love has faded. It is that the muscle for saying it was never built. You practiced silence for 50 years. Fluency in something that's specific does not arrive overnight, even when you finally want it. That hesitation you feel isn't coldness. It's simply a language you were never taught to speak out loud. The good news, if there is good news in a regret, is that this one is fixable in real time. Unlike some of what we'll talk about today, this door has not closed. If there is someone whose name comes to mind right now, that is not a coincidence. That is your own heart, telling you exactly where to start. Reason number 2 follows naturally from the first because it is about another kind of silence, the silence that comes not from what we never learned to say, but from what we kept postponing. Almost everyone carries at least one relationship that broke, quietly, somewhere in the middle of life. A sibling, an old friend, a parent, and almost everyone tells themselves the same comforting lie. We'll fix it eventually, when things calm down, when the time is right. The trouble with waiting for the right time is that the right time is not a real thing. It is a story we tell ourselves so that avoiding a hard conversation does not feel like avoidance. It feels like patience. And patience sounds virtuous. Avoidance does not. So we choose the word that lets us sleep at night. But conflict does not wait politely in a drawer for you to be ready. Calcifies. Every month that passes without contact adds another thin layer of distance, until what began as a single disagreement, over money, over a wedding, over words said in anger at a funeral, becomes something much larger and much harder to name. Eventually, neither person can even remember exactly what the original argument was about. What remains is only the habit of not speaking, which somehow feels sturdier and more permanent than the argument itself ever was. This is one of the cruelest tricks of time. It does not heal every wound automatically, the way we like to believe. Sometimes it just adds distance on top of the wound, layer after layer, until reconciliation stops feeling like closing a small gap and starts feeling like crossing an ocean. The longer you wait, the larger the first sentence has to be. And a large first sentence is terrifying, so you wait a little longer, hoping it will somehow become smaller on its own. It does not. This shows up most often between siblings, people who share an entire childhood, a set of parents, a family history no one else on earth remembers the same way you do, and yet somehow drift into decades of near strangers, connected only by a shared last name and a once-a-year holiday card. The holidays, oddly enough, tend to make this worse rather than better. A large family gathering can absorb an estranged relationship almost invisibly. You nod across the room, you avoid the same corner of the kitchen, you let other conversations fill the space where a real one used to be. It feels, for one afternoon, almost manageable. But then everyone drives home, and the actual gap between you is exactly the same size it was the day before, quietly waiting for next year's gathering to paper over it again. A once-a-year nod is not a relationship. It is simply a very well-rehearsed way of postponing one. Many people only find the courage to reach out when something forces their hand. An illness, a diagnosis, a funeral of someone else that reminds them how short all of this actually is. And sometimes that phone call, made at the last possible moment, becomes one of the most meaningful conversations of a person's whole life. But sometimes the call comes 1 week too late. Sometimes the number still rings, but no one answers because the other person has already been gone 6 months and nobody thought to tell you, because you were, after all, the one who had gone silent first. This is why the regret here is rarely about the original conflict. Almost no one, looking back from their 70s or 80s, is still angry about the specific argument. What they carry instead is something quieter and heavier. The years spent waiting for permission from a right time that was never going to arrive on its own, because it was never a real place. It was always something you had to build yourself with one uncomfortable phone call. What you are feeling isn't stubbornness. It's fear wearing the costume of pride. If there is a name from this category sitting in the back of your mind right now, the right time was never going to announce itself. The right time is simply the next time you pick up the phone. Reason number 3 is close cousin to the one we just discussed, but it deserves its own space because it is not about distance. It is about something that happened when you were standing right next to each other. Picture an argument from 30 years ago. You can probably still see the room it happened in. You may even remember exactly what you were wearing. And somewhere in the middle of that argument you actually knew in real time that you were at least partly wrong. But you did not say so. Not that day. Maybe not ever. Apologizing first has always been one of the hardest things a person can do, because it requires temporarily setting down the story you have been telling yourself. The story where you are the reasonable one, the wronged one, the one who was simply defending what was fair. To apologize first means admitting, out loud, that the story might be incomplete. For many people, that admission feels more threatening than the original conflict ever did. Pride convinces you that waiting for the other person to apologize first is a matter of principle. It rarely is. Usually it is simply fear dressed up as dignity. Fear of being the one who cared more, fear of looking weak, fear that admitting fault will somehow confirm every insecurity you have ever quietly carried about yourself. So both people wait. Both people convince themselves they are simply standing on principle. And the silence between two proud, waiting people can stretch on for years, sometimes for good, because neither one wants to be the first to blink. What almost no one realizes in the moment is how small the actual cost of apologizing first really is, compared to the cost of not apologizing at all. An apology, even an imperfect one, even one that only addresses part of what went wrong, tends to soften a room almost instantly. It rarely gets rejected the way pride insists it will. Most people, when someone finally says, "I was wrong about part of that and I'm sorry," do not respond with more anger. They exhale. They soften. Because they, too, have been waiting, tired of holding up their own side of the same silence. Part of what keeps pride so firmly in place is a quiet misunderstanding about what apologizing actually costs. It feels, in the moment, like losing, like handing the other person a small victory you will never get back. But almost no one who has actually apologized first and meant it describes the aftermath that way. They describe relief. They describe the strange lightness of finally putting down something they had been carrying, sometimes for years, without even realizing how heavy it had become. The apology was never really the loss. The years of silence were. This regret has a particular sting when it involves a parent and a child, because the clock there is not abstract. It runs in one direction only, and everyone quietly knows it. A father who never said, "I was too hard on you," to a now grown son. A mother who never told her daughter, "I see now that I put too much on you too young." These sentences are not complicated. They are just heavy with years of pride stacked on top of them, 1 year at a time, until lifting them feels like lifting something enormous, when really it never was. The people who reach their later years without this regret are rarely the ones who were right more often than everyone else. They are simply the ones who learned, sometimes the hard way, that being right and being close are not always the same goal, and that when you have to choose between them, closeness is almost always the one you will miss more. This isn't weakness. It's the bravest sentence most people never learn to say out loud. If pride has ever cost you a relationship you still think about, the door usually is not as closed as pride wants you to believe. It is only closed if you decide it is. Reason number 4 moves us into a different kind of regret. Not about a single relationship gone quiet, but about an entire season of life that slipped by while your attention was somewhere else. How many dinners did you miss? Not the big ones, not Thanksgiving, not birthdays. The small, forgettable Tuesday night dinners. The ones nobody remembers individually, but that added up over years into thousands of ordinary evenings when you were not at the table. For most people who raised children in the middle of the last century, and even for plenty raising children today, providing was the job. You worked long hours because the mortgage needed paying, because college needed saving for, because a family cannot run on love alone, no matter how much love is in the house. This was not selfishness. In almost every case, it was the opposite. A form of love expressed through sacrifice, through exhaustion, through leaving before the children woke and coming home after they were already in bed. But here is what almost no one tells you at the time, when you are 34 years old and running on coffee and responsibility. Children do not experience your love as a paycheck. They experience it as your face at their school play, your voice reading one more chapter before lights out, your presence at the kitchen table, even on a Tuesday that meant nothing to anyone but them. A child cannot yet understand the abstract concept of financial security. What they understand in their bones is whether you were there. This creates one of the most painful gaps in how love is given and how love is received. You may have worked those brutal hours precisely because you loved your children so much you were willing to sacrifice time with them in order to secure their future. And your children may have grown up quietly believing that work mattered more to you than they did. Not because it is true, but because a child's understanding of love is built entirely from presence, not from provision. Two people, standing in the exact same story, can walk away with two completely different memories of what it meant. By the time you have the perspective to see this clearly, usually somewhere in your 60s or 70s, once your own children are grown and perhaps raising children of their own, the specific Tuesday nights are long gone. You cannot go back and sit at that table. What you can do, and what many people in your position eventually learn to do, is say the quiet part out loud to your now adult child. I know I wasn't there as much as I wanted to be. I know why it might have felt like something else. It was never that. Sometimes this regret sharpens further when you watch your own grown child repeat the exact same pattern with their kids, working the same long hours, missing the same small dinners, for the same understandable reasons. You want to say something, more clearly than anyone else could, exactly what it costs and exactly how it will feel 30 years from now. But you also know how it would have sounded to hear it from someone else back then, so mostly you just show up a little more yourself, quietly trying to fill in what you can. This is part of why so many people become almost startlingly present grandparents, showing up to every recital, every small league game, sitting on the floor for hours doing puzzles they never had time for the first time around. It is not only love for the grandchild. It is, quietly, an attempt to close a gap that opened up a generation earlier, one Tuesday night at a time. That ache isn't guilt for its own sake. This love, arriving late, looking for somewhere to land. If this is your reason, know that presence now still counts. It doesn't erase the missed dinners, but it isn't trying to. It's simply proof that the love was, and still is, real. Before we go further, I want to pause here for just a moment. If you have made it this far, something in what we've talked about has probably already found its mark. A name, a memory, an unfinished sentence of your own. Stay with me because reason number 5 might be the quietest regret of all, and for many people it is the one that hurts the longest. Somewhere in your house there is probably an old photograph of one of your parents as a young person. Someone you never actually met because by the time you were old enough to be curious they had already become simply mom or dad, fully formed with no visible past. Here is something strange about how most of us grow up. We spend the first 18 or 20 years of our lives completely certain that our parents exist mainly in relation to us. We rarely think to ask them who they were before we arrived, what frightened them at 19, who broke their heart before they met the person they eventually married, what dream they quietly let go of the year you were born. By the time we are old enough to actually be curious about these things, old enough to ask good questions and really listen to the answers, our parents are often already elderly themselves. And not long after that, they are gone, taking an entire unrepeatable library of memory with them. This regret is different from the others we have talked about today, because it cannot be fixed with a phone call, no matter how brave you are willing to be. There is no reconciliation available here. The person who could answer your questions, what was it like when you left home at 17, what really happened in that year no one talks about, what were you most afraid of, what were you most proud of? That person is simply not available to ask anymore. What is left is not a relationship to repair. It is a silence that will not be broken, no matter how much you now wish it could be. Many people describe a very specific, almost physical moment when this regret arrives. It often comes at the parent's funeral or shortly after, when a distant cousin mentions some detail about your mother's childhood you had never once heard, and you realize all at once that there were entire decades of her life you knew almost nothing about, because you never thought to ask while asking was still possible. The stories did not disappear because your parent refused to tell them. They disappeared because nobody sat down and asked the right questions at the right time. And stories, unlike photographs, cannot simply be found later in a box in the attic. Once the person carrying them is gone, the stories go with them permanently. Sometimes the missed question is astonishingly specific. A father who survived a war and never once talked about it, not because he was hiding something dramatic, but because no one ever asked him gently at the right moment in the right way. A mother who mentioned only once in passing a man she almost married before your father, and then changed the subject and was never asked about it again, not out of respect exactly, but out of a kind of shyness that felt easier than curiosity. These small, specific, unopened doors are usually the ones people think of first, late at night, once the person who could have opened them is gone. If your own parents are gone, this regret cannot be undone, only understood and released. But if you have grandchildren or even adult children, there is a version of this you can still change. Not by asking your parents questions, but by finally letting yourself be asked. By telling the stories before someone has to go looking for them in a box after you're gone. This isn't a failure on your part. It's simply what happens when we mistake people for roles instead of remembering they were always whole lives, long before us. So let me ask you honestly, is there someone in your life right now whose story you still don't fully know? That single question is not too late to ask, if the person is still here. And it might be the most generous gift you give them, and yourself, before there's no one left to answer. Reason number 6 turns our attention toward the relationships that are still very much alive. The ones you're in every single day, because silence, we're learning, comes in more than one form. For decades, you may have believed that keeping the peace meant staying quiet. Biting your tongue at Sunday dinner. Letting a comment slide instead of correcting it. Choosing, again and again, to swallow what you actually felt in order to keep the room calm. This habit often starts early, sometimes in childhood homes where conflict was dangerous or unpredictable, and staying quiet was the safest way to survive. It gets reinforced through decades of marriage, parenting, and friendship, where avoiding an argument can feel, in the moment, like the more loving choice. Why bring up something small and risk a fight, when it would be so much easier to just let it go? Multiply that decision by thousands of small moments across 60 years, and you get something that looks, from the outside, like a remarkably peaceful life. But peace and silence are not actually the same thing, even though they can look identical from a distance. Real peace comes from two people who have worked through their differences and arrived somewhere solid together. What many people build instead is something quieter and more fragile. An agreement never spoken aloud to simply not discuss the things that might cause discomfort. Can hold for years. Can even feel, most days, like genuine closeness. But underneath it, something is usually missing, the specific, particular knowledge of what the other person actually thinks and feels, because so much of it was never said. Ask yourself honestly, how many times did you agree with your spouse out loud while disagreeing quietly inside, simply because the argument didn't feel worth having? Each of those moments on its own was small. All of them together may be the reason a 50-year marriage can still feel, at times, oddly lonely. Friendships carry a quieter version of the same pattern. Two people can golf together or sit at the same church pew or talk on the phone every Sunday for 30 straight years and never once discuss the thing that actually hurt one of them a decade ago. A comment at a party, a favor that was never returned, a moment of feeling forgotten. The friendship survives, technically. It simply survives a little smaller than it could have been, both people quietly agreeing without ever saying so, to keep things pleasant instead of keeping things real. This is not an argument for picking constant fights. It is something gentler and, in some ways, sadder. A recognition that some of the peace we spent a lifetime protecting may have quietly cost us real closeness, one avoided conversation at a time, and that the people we kept the peace with may have wanted more from us than comfort. They may have wanted to be truly seen, disagreements and all. That isn't peace. That's two people, quietly agreeing not to fully know each other. So what would it look like, even now, to say the true thing instead of the comfortable one? It is not too late to trade a little bit of comfort for a little more closeness. At this stage of life, that trade is almost always worth making. Reason number 7 asks you to look not at another person, but at yourself, and specifically, at a version of yourself you may have quietly left behind a long time ago. Think of the thing you wanted to do, really wanted with your whole chest, sometime in your 20s or 30s, the business you thought about starting, the instrument you thought about learning, the city you thought about moving to alone just to see what would happen. Somewhere along the way, you probably talked yourself out of it using a very reasonable-sounding word. Safer. Almost no one regrets choosing responsibility itself. Providing for a family, staying in a stable job, building a secure and predictable life. These are not mistakes, and most people who made those choices would make them again. What people quietly regret decades later is something more specific. Not that they chose the safe path, but that they never let themselves seriously consider the other one, even for a season, even just to know for certain. There is a particular kind of ache that comes from never actually finding out. It is different from failure. If you had tried the business and it had collapsed, you would at least know. If you had moved to that city and hated it, you would at least know. What so many people carry instead is an open question that never got closed. A permanent maybe, sitting quietly in the back of their mind for 50 years, occasionally surfacing at 3 in the morning or during a long drive alone, asking gently but persistently, what if? Psychologically, this kind of regret tends to grow heavier over time, not lighter, because it was never resolved by evidence. A regret about something you did and failed at can eventually be filed away, understood, even made peace with. You tried, and it didn't work, and that's a complete story. But a regret about something you never attempted has no ending. It simply stays open, an unfinished sentence your mind returns to again and again, because there was never a final period put at the end of it. This does not mean it is too late to try new things. Many people discover entirely new passions and pursuits well into their 70s and 80s, and that is real and valuable. But this particular regret is not really about the specific dream itself anymore. Here is something worth noticing, though. The stakes that once made the safe choice feel necessary have usually changed by now. At 30, walking away from a stable job to try something uncertain could mean real risk to a young family. At 70 or 80, that same leap often costs far less than it once would have. There is no mortgage riding on whether the watercolor class goes well. No child's college fund depends on whether the memoir gets finished. The old excuse that it was too risky has, for many people, quietly stopped being true, even if it does not always feel that way yet. There is an old line that captures this better than almost anything else, one worth sitting with for a moment. 20 years from now, you will likely be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did. It is often attributed to Mark Twain, and whether or not he said those exact words, the truth inside them does not depend on who said it first. It has simply been confirmed quietly over and over by people looking back on that isn't cowardice looking back at you. It's simply grief for a door you never tried opening. If there's still a door like that in your life, even a small one, what would it cost you to at least look through it now? You may not have 50 more years to experiment, but you likely have more time than you think, and far more permission than you're giving yourself to finally find out. Reason number 8 is a little different from the ones before it because it isn't about a mistake exactly. It's about a mistaken idea of what actually counts as time well spent. How many ordinary afternoons did you skip together? The boring ones, the nothing special ones, because you were waiting for a real occasion to make the time worth taking. Many people carry an unspoken belief that quality time needs to be earned through an event. A holiday, a birthday, a big trip, something worth planning for. Ordinary time, the kind with no occasion attached to it, can start to feel almost unworthy of the effort. Why drive over on a random Wednesday when there's nothing to celebrate? Why call just because when there's no news to share? So the ordinary days quietly get skipped, saved up, deferred in favor of the big ones, and there are always fewer big ones than ordinary ones. That is simply how a calendar works. But here is what almost everyone eventually discovers, usually far later than they would like. It is the ordinary time that people remember most and miss most once it's gone. Almost no one, looking back at a parent or a spouse or an old friend, says, "I wish we'd had one more Christmas together." What people say instead is something smaller and more specific. "I wish we'd had one more regular Tuesday. One more nothing afternoon on the porch. One more ordinary phone call about absolutely nothing at all." This is because closeness is not actually built in the big moments. It is built in the accumulation of small, unremarkable ones. A relationship sustained only by holidays and milestones tends to stay somewhat formal, somewhat performed, no matter how much love is genuinely present. It is the thousand small, forgettable Tuesdays, the errands run together, the meals eaten in comfortable silence, the low-stakes conversations about nothing important, that actually build the kind of intimacy people miss the most when someone is gone. By the time this becomes obvious, the ordinary days that were skipped cannot be gotten back. You cannot retroactively create a decade of casual Wednesday afternoons with someone who has already passed away. What you are left with instead is a strange kind of regret. Not for anything dramatic that went wrong, but simply for how much unremarkable, available time was quietly treated as not worth using. There is a newer version of this same mistake worth naming too. These days, a quick text can feel like it satisfies the urge to stay in touch. A thumbs-up emoji, a thinking of you, sent and answered in seconds. It is not nothing, but it is not quite the same as an actual voice on the phone or an actual afternoon spent in the same room. The convenience of staying lightly in touch can quietly replace the harder, more valuable work of staying truly close, and most people do not notice the substitution happening until they miss the version that used to take real time. If there is anyone left in your life you have been saving for a special occasion, a call, a visit, a lunch, this is the moment to reconsider that instinct. The most valuable time you have left with the people you love is very likely going to be ordinary time. Start treating it that way. That instinct to wait for the right occasion isn't wisdom. It's simply a habit that costs more than it seems to. So what's stopping you from calling someone today? For absolutely no reason at all?